Hello, good morning. All right, so today we're taking a look at reproductive isolation and speciation, which actually starts on page 281 in your textbook. All right, so we've spoken about speciation before kind of as an idea, and its definition is a formation of a new species. That's covered slightly by my clip, I apologise, but that is what speciation is. It's your formation of a new species. And there can be a couple of different reasons why this can occur. All right, I'm going to do hybridization first because it's shorter. So you can get speciation occurring because of hybridization, and this is particularly common in two plants. So this is where two closely related species can breed and they can form fertile hybrids. And then when you crossbreed them back with the parent plant, so one of the parent species, they don't produce fertile offspring. So in this way, you must have an entirely new species in your hybrid. So when we are talking about what it means to be a species, we kind of spoke about hybrid plants and at what point do those hybrids, the hybrid offsprings become new species. So it's at that point when you take your hybrid and you breed it with the parent plant and it doesn't produce fertile offspring. So what that means is you now have a new species of plants. So that's one way that speciation can occur. What happens more commonly, and what is kind of a more important driving force behind speciation, is this result of isolation. And when we're talking about isolation, we mean reproductive isolation. So in reproductive isolation, there's reduced gene flow between different populations as a consequence of isolation. Okay, so essentially they can't, breed with each other for various different reasons, and so because of this, we get some speciation. So in your isolation, you have two isolated populations, and they experience different conditions. There are different selection pressures. So they could have different environmental conditions, different food sources, anything like this, and so these become different selection pressures. And so then over time, the genotype and the phenotype of the two isolated populations will change. And it's at this point you have new species, because if those two isolated populations were brought back together, then they might be able to breed, but they would not produce fertile offspring. So it's at that point that we have to say that they are two different species. Now, reproductive isolation is the overall kind of aim, so these animals cannot reproduce with each other. But the reasons why reproductive isolation might occur, there are a few different ones, different isolating mechanisms. So these are geographical isolation, so that's going to be your physical barrier, so it could be a river, a mountain range, something like that. You've got ecological isolation, so this is when your populations live in the same region but have different habitat preferences. So it could be, they live in the same geographical region, but for some reason one of them likes to live in one type of tree and another one likes to live in a different type of tree. Seasonal isolation, so this is when the timing of flowering or sexual receptiveness becomes different. So the species can't, or the populations I should say, can't actually mate with each other because they're not, fertile during the same time period. Behavioural, so this is when there might be changes in the courtship ritual, for example. Lots of male animals display to attract females. So again, if that's kind of changed, the different organisms are not going to recognise each other as potential mates, so therefore they're not going to successfully mate and reproduce. And then there could be mechanical isolation. And this is where you've got a mutation that causes changes in the genitalia of the animals, or the organism really we should say, because it can happen in plants as well. So they can only successfully mate with some members of the group. So, the mutation, it changes their physical, their genitalia, their reproductive organs. So they're no longer able to mate with all of them. They're only allowed to kind of mate with the ones that have, the corresponding sexual organs to their own. So biggest kind of takeaway from this is hybridization can cause speciation, and reproductive isolation is your main driving force behind speciation. And that reproductive isolation, so that inability for your different species to kind of breed with each other can be caused by those 5 different sort of isolation mechanisms. All right, so we're going to kind of look at different types of speciation now. And the first one we've got to look at is allotropic speciation, which kind of goes hand in hand with adaptive radiation. So we'll deal with it kind of in two sides. So your first thing to know is that allotropic speciation occurs when populations have been physically or geographically separated. Okay, so that geographical isolation that I spoke about on the last page, when that's happening, we get allotropic speciation. And allotropic speciation is actually the main evolutionary process. It's kind of how scientists believe evolution has occurred, broadly across all of our organisms over obviously millions of years. So think about it, when the world first formed, all the land masses were kind of together, and then obviously as Earth grew in age and developed, those land masses moved and separated. And so our species became geographically and physically separated. So we are able to get this allotropic speciation. Now, physical isolation continues today. Our land masses are quite settled. They're not drifting apart in the same way. But this isolation geographically still continues today. And it can either be because of natural changes. So think of islands forming and disappearing, or perhaps a river changing course. And obviously, as with everything in this kind of unit, it can also be a result of human intervention. So humans building dams, roads or cities. That can cause this geographical separation that leads to allotropic speciation, even though, the land masses aren't moving in the same way as they were originally. Now, allotropic speciation is often followed by this adaptive radiation. Okay, so allotropic speciation, remember, is a speciation as a result of this geographical isolation. So that's kind of the first bit, and then it's typically followed by adaptive radiation. So adaptive radiation occurs when one species develops rapidly to form several different species which all fill different ecological niches. All right, so an example of this, to give you kind of a bit of context, or there's two examples actually. First of which is to do with Australia. We seem to be talking about Australia a lot in this unit, but that is the Australian marsupials and monotremes. So marsupials and monotremes, or monotremes, I say tremes because it's more fun, but they are both examples of mammals. Okay, so a marsupial protect their young in the pouches. Marsupials you guys are going to be aware of, koalas, kangaroos, those types of things. The monotremes are actually egg layers, and an example of that is a platypus. Okay, now in the rest of the world, and outside of Australia, the placental mammals dominate. Placental mammal is going to be one that has a pregnancy similar to a human pregnancy. The fetus or embryo develops in utero, in the uterus, supported by the placenta, until it's kind of reached full term. All right, and so that's kind of the difference between Australia and the rest of the world. Now, until 5.5 million years ago, Australia was joined to the rest of the world's landmass. So if you've ever looked at a globe or a map, you'll know that Australia is kind of its own island, kind of a bit of away from everyone else. But before that, 5.5 million years ago, it was actually all together as part of the main kind of landmass of the world. And at that time, the only mammals were marsupials and monotremes. And then after Australia separated, your marsupials evolved to fill a range of niches. For example, the koala, which its niche is the eucalyptus tree, consuming that. Or an example of a carnivorous niche would be something like a Tasmanian devil. So after Australia separated away, the marsupials that were still present on the landmass that we now know as Australia kind of evolved to fill all the different niches that were open and kind of up for grabs. Whereas on the other continents, the placental mammals evolved and mostly replaced the marsupials and the monotremes. So you don't find marsupials and monotremes naturally in any other sort of areas, because the placental mammal evolved and took over. So the placental mammal evolved to take over the niches that were sort of exposed in the rest of the land masses. And these placental mammals didn't actually reach Australia until humans arrived and kind of physically introduced them. So as you can see here, we've got an example of adaptive radiation, because our species has evolved and developed rapidly to form several different species which all fill different ecological niches. So those original marsupials have evolved and kind of adapted into the different marsupial species to meet all the different niches that now have come about because of our allotropic speciation, because of Australia separating off onto its own. Okay, another example, just to give kind of more context, and I think the more examples you've got, the easier it is to understand, is perhaps more famous to you guys, and perhaps a little bit more about, is Darwin's finches. So these finches were discovered in the 19th century by Charles Darwin on the Galapagos Islands. Excuse me. And in the Galapagos Islands, there are several feeding niches for birds. So you could fill the niche of eating large seeds, you could fill the niche of eating small seeds, you could fill the niche of eating insects that live on rotten bark. Okay, now the original finches that arrived on the island were of a single species. No one really knows how these finches arrived on the island because the Galapagos Islands are kind of really isolated in terms of geographically. I think in the book, if I remember correctly, it says they're like 500 miles away. I think it is. Let's have a quick look, sorry. Yeah. So, because the islands are over 500 miles away from land, so no one really knows how these original finches arrived there, but it's possible that some kind of hurricane or storm blew a small flock off of course. Anyway, however they got there, these original finches were all of a single species. But within the birds that arrived, there would have been variations in alleles and characteristics. So some would have had a slightly smaller and stronger beak. Some would have had a slightly longer and thinner beak. Obviously, the small, strong beak birds are kind of more adapted to eat small seeds. They can break the seed with their strong beak. Whereas the longer, thinner ones, they might be more adapted to eating insects. They could use their long, thin beak to get into that bark, into those trees to consume those insects. So because of these different adaptations, natural selection occurred. So the small, strong beak birds would obviously have flourished in areas where they could eat that food source, and they would pass on their genes that way. And the longer, thinner beak birds would flourish where they could consume their food source, and then they would be able to pass on their genes onto future offspring. So as over the generations, natural selection meant that these characteristics became more and more pronounced. And by exploiting these different niches, so small insects, large insects, seeds, those kind of things, the finches avoided competing for the same scarce food resources. So what that meant is, that habitat could support all of these different finches because there wasn't that competition for food, which, as I'm sure you can appreciate, in kind of an isolated island is going to be quite scarce. So over the course of several million years, at least 14 different species of finch have emerged on the Galapagos from one common ancestral species. Okay, so we've got our geographical isolation leading to allopatric speciation. Okay, so we've had our geographical isolation, we've had one species kind of emerge, and now we've got our adaptive radiation because our birds have exploited the different niches, so several species have flourished. All right, it's going to be another two-parter of a video, so please watch the next one, and we're going to carry on with some different kind of types of speciation.